Hi, Jonah Lotta here. Today we're going to talk about Porter's 5 forces, and in particular, we're going to try to go over the intuition behind Porter's 5 forces. So this is doing your industry analysis and see if we can get our hands around what are Porter's 5 forces and why do we do this sort of analysis. So our objectives for today are really to explain why do we conduct industry analysis or the Porter's 5 forces. And so our learning objectives for today, the first one is to explain why it is that we actually conduct industry analysis or do Porter's 5 forces, to identify exactly what the 5 forces are, and the last one is to address what questions Porter's 5 forces actually answers. So then the next thing is the question is, why do we do industry analysis? What does Porter's 5 forces answer? So if you take a second, again, pause the video and write down a couple of ideas of what questions do you think Porter's 5 forces answers. The answers that I've heard include that we want to understand the competition, right? So we're analyzing a particular firm and we want to understand the competition that they have. And true enough, Porter's 5 forces does answer that to some extent, right? So one of the 5 forces is looking at how rivalrous the competition is, how rivalrous is that industry. So that's part of the answer, So another answer that I've heard is to know if a company will make profits. And so Porter's does not answer that particular question. It doesn't look at one particular company and say, is that company going to be profitable? It's looking at, on average, is this industry profitable? Are the competitors in that industry making profits, on average? So it doesn't look at a specific company. The last answer that I tend to hear is that the question is about entry. So should a company enter an industry? And Porter's 5 forces doesn't answer that explicitly, but entry is one of the areas that is addressed. That if you go back to what the answer really is about, it's about determining the attractiveness of the industry. And when we say attractiveness, we're talking about the profitability of the industry. So on average, is that industry profitable? Okay, so it sort of begs the question, if we're looking at industry analysis, is what is an industry? And so what we say is it's a group of firms producing products that are pretty similar to each other, right? So they're pretty close substitutes for each other. And the government actually has a way of classifying industries, right? So you can see that soybean farming, right? That once you get to that level of detail, right? Soybeans are pretty similar to each other, and different farmers, different competitors in that industry could be selling soybeans, and those are pretty close substitutes. All right, so that's sort of what when we're thinking about what an industry is, that's what we're thinking about. All right, so when we look at industries, we can think of them, the structure of those industries, along a continuum. And at one end of the continuum, you have monopolies, right? And a monopoly is one firm in that industry, they're able to price above their marginal costs, and it sort of has above average profits, right? So they get those monopoly rents. And the structure of that industry looks very different from a firm at the other end of the continuum, right? So at the other end of the continuum are perfectly competitive markets. So at one end you have monopolies, at the other end you have perfectly competitive markets. And in those perfectly competitive markets, right, so the examples are taxi service or wheat, you have many, many firms, and there is relatively easy entry and exit from the industry, and there's a price-taking sort of behavior. And a monopoly sort of industry, the structure of that looks very different from a perfectly competitive market. And so along the continuum, they're all different structures of markets, and sort of in the middle, you might see oligopolistic competition, right? So that's kind of that middle ground. All right? So those should give you a flavor as we're thinking about industry structure and how they may differ across industries. Those are some of the things you may want to think about. So here is Porter's 5 forces, and the way it's presented here, in most places that you look, it's going to be presented in a very similar manner. So we have our players in the industry, right? So we have our suppliers, we have our industry competitors, and we have our buyers. we have our potential entrants, and we have our substitutes. So those are the players. But we also have our forces, right? So we have the bargaining power of suppliers. We have the intensity of rivalry amongst the competitors. We have the bargaining power of buyers. We have the threat of potential entrants, and we have the threat of substitutes. So as you look at this, that's how you're going to see that in general as we go. All right, so we've previously looked at the value price cost framework. And the idea of the value price cost framework is this idea of value creation and value capture. All right, so the value price cost framework, we have at the top here, value or the customer's willingness to pay. We have price, and we have cost. Right? The difference between a customer's willingness to pay and the price of a product is what we call consumer surplus. All right, so the customers are capturing that value. So if we were willing to pay $100, but it's actually priced at $80, we capture, as consumers, we capture $20 in value. Right? The difference between the price and the cost, so let's say the cost was $50, right? So it's priced at $80, the cost is $50. The value that the firm captures is $30. All right, so firms are able to create value by pushing up the consumer's willingness to pay or pressing down on costs or squeezing out costs. Right, so they create value by doing that, by increasing this. And they capture value to the extent that they can raise price or lower costs. All right, so it's this idea of value creation and value capture. The idea for Porter's 5 forces is really looking at the value capture side of things, right? So the idea is, do the competitors in the industry capture the value, or do other players capture that value? Okay, so here's the intuition, right? Here's the visual and the intuition for Porter's 5 forces. So we're going to start with, what do I have here? What do I have here? And so to the untrained eye, it looks like I have a big jar of coins and a smaller jar of coins. But in reality, to the trained eye, what they actually represent are potential industry profits. Okay, so they're potential industry profits. So they're not actual profits, but they're potential industry profits. All right, so we're going to take these coins and we're going to put them down here. And we're going to sort of walk our way through Porter's 5 forces. So if it's an attractive industry, the industry competitors are going to capture these profits, right? And you would tend to see most of the coins here in the middle. When the other forces are in play and the structure of the industry suggests that the suppliers or the buyers very powerful, then they're going to be capturing that value. All right, so we'll start and work our way around the 5 forces and see what happens here. So we're going to start with the easy ones. All right, so what happens when the bargaining power of suppliers is very high? So you can imagine suppliers for a particular industry where there's only 1 or 2 really big suppliers and you have to go to them. So what happens in those cases? Well, they may be able to charge higher prices, right? So the cost for the industry is very high, and so they're going to capture some of that value. All right, so they're able to price higher here, and so the cost to you as an industry competitor is higher. All right, now let's think about the bargaining power of the buyers. All right, so you imagine the government or big corporations who buy things in bulk. They can leverage their size and leverage that power to get favorable pricing for them. So then who captures that? If they're able to get favorable pricing, then who captures the value? Well, the buyers are able to do that, right? So the price will be lower and the buyers capture that value, right? Because they've caused you to price lower. All right, the next one is the threat of potential entrance, right? So the threat of new entry. So what happens there? It isn't actual entry, right? Actual entry would then mean it's that potential entrant has become a competitor. So just the threat of them being on the sidelines and potentially coming in serves to keep prices in the industry lower. And so who captures that value, right? So these guys haven't come in yet, but their prices are lower. And so who captures that value? So again, the buyers are going to capture that value. All right. The threat of substitutes, right? So what's a substitute product? So if you think about the sugar industry, a substitute would be honey, right? So it's a pretty close substitute for what that industry product is. All right. So what's the effect of having viable substitutes? So at a reasonable price, we've got our substitutes. That serves to keep price down. And so how does that impact things, right? So who's capturing that value? So again, the buyers are capturing that value. And in some cases, if the buyer leaves the industry and doesn't purchase sugar, but instead purchases that honey, then some of that is going to actually leave the industry and go to the substitute industry. All right. And the last one here, the last of the 5 forces, is rivalry amongst the competitors, right? So what happens when there's an industry in which the products that are in that industry are pretty similar? There's not a lot of differentiation, that competitors are competing more on price than on product features. So that serves to keep price down. And again, who captures that value? The buyers are capturing that value. And so there's just a little bit left for the competitors in the industry to capture. Okay, so when you sort of see other players in the industry capturing value, right? So the structure of the industry is such that other players are capturing value, then the industry is less attractive. It's unattractive, and it's less profitable to the competitors in that industry. Right? So Porter's 5 forces is always from the perspective of the competitors that are in this industry. All right. So what would the coins look like, and where would the profits be if this were an attractive industry? Well, you would see more of the coins in this middle box here, right? And where the competitors are capturing that value. All right. So the question is, as a manager, do you accept the industry structure as it is? Are there ways that you can maybe influence that industry structure? And what you see sometimes when you read about mergers and acquisitions or industry consolidation, similar to what you see in the airline industry, the process of those mergers makes for fewer competitors in the industry, less rivalry, which makes the industry a bit more attractive. All right, so as a manager, you're sort of thinking about ways that it may make the industry more attractive and may increase your profitability. So that's really the intuition and the visual behind Porter's 5 forces. So to summarize then, why do we do industry analysis? Is so that we better understand the structure of the industry and we understand how those forces impact the profitability of the industry. So opportunities for profit are not just a matter of chance. They are in part about how that structure of the industry, the bargaining power of suppliers or buyers, the threat of entry, the intensity of rivalry, how those forces impact the profitability of the competitors in that industry. So industries that have more attractive structures are going to be more profitable, and they're going to have consistently higher profits than other industries that may have less attractive structural characteristics. All right. To summarize our objectives for today, we're to understand why we conduct industry analysis, to identify what the 5 forces are, and to identify what questions industry analysis and Porter's 5 forces answers.